Good morning and welcome. I'm going to call the meeting of public accounts to order in the absence due to illness of the regular chair. I will be chairing today's meeting. May I remind members if they have cell phones with them to either turn them off or put them to the setting of vibrate. That would be a big help. Thank you. The business of the committee today is to hear a briefing from the Department of Finance, and following that we have some committee business, and following that we have an in-camera briefing on the topic of homeschooling from the Auditor General, preparatory to a meeting on that topic after that. May I ask the members of the committee to introduce themselves, please?
Gary Ramey, good morning. I'm the member for Lunenburg West.
Good morning, Matt Wynot, MLA Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Good morning, Brian Scabar, Cumberland North.
Good morning and welcome, Clary McKinnon, MLA Pictou East.
Andrew Younger, Dartmouth East.
Jamie Bailey, Cumberland South.
Alfie McLeod, Cape Breton West.
Thank you, and perhaps all others present could introduce themselves.
Anne McDonald, Assistant Auditor General.
Jacques Lapointe, Auditor General.
Darlene Henry, Committee Clerk.
Byron Rayfuse, Assistant Deputy Minister and Controller for the Province of Nova Scotia.
Liz Cody, Deputy Minister, Province of Nova Scotia.
Thank you and welcome to our guests. Deputy, did you or Mr. Rayfuse wish to make an introductory statement?
Thank you very much. Yes, I would. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to the committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the Auditor General's February 2013 report. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my colleague Byron Rayfuse, who today has joined me. Byron is the Department of Finance's Associate Deputy Minister and the Provincial Controller. I know the members of the committee know Byron quite well and have worked with him before. I'd like to begin this morning by saying that the Department of Finance works very closely with the Office of the Auditor General throughout the year on a number of issues, but primarily in the preparation of the provincial budget review estimates and the year-end public accounts. In the Auditor General's February 2013 report, there were several positive comments and, as expected, some areas for improvement. On a $9 billion budget, there are bound to be areas where we can make improvements, and the process gets stronger every year. My department values the work of Mr. Lapointe's office and takes the Auditor General recommendations very seriously. We have accepted all of the comments and the recommendations in his most recent report. Some have already been addressed or are well underway. From the February report, certainly the most prominent issue is Mr. Lapointe's comments on the 2012-13 budget deficit. I'm pleased to address this issue today, and I certainly hope to clear up any misunderstanding about how budget revenue estimates are put together. I've worked for the province of Nova Scotia for over 30 years with the Department of Finance and Treasury Board. I can say without a doubt that Nova Scotia has some of the most transparent budget preparation and reporting processes in Canada. Aside from the presentation of the budget, forecast estimates are given at least twice a year, and the fiscal year is closed with the public accounts. This cycle ensures that any changes to the forecast throughout the year are reported openly and clearly. I want to make it clear that in the 2012-13 budget, the department looked at quarterly data that was released at the beginning of March. Based on professional opinions and the fact that it was well below the threshold of materiality, a decision was made not to include the information. As well, the lateness in receiving and assessing this information resulted in it being brought forward to Treasury Board very late in the budget process. In Nova Scotia, unlike any other province, we are required to have the Auditor General's office review the reasonableness of the budget revenue estimates. This extra layer of scrutiny certainly stands out in Canada and makes it for a tighter and more thorough review. The Auditor General's letter included in the 2012 Assumptions and Schedules document makes clear that our revenue estimates are presented fairly and comply with the standards of the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. I'm happy to table Mr. Lapointe's letter. For our economic forecast, we hold a challenge and review session each year. I put the emphasis on challenge because our estimates are looked at in great detail by local and national experts. Last year's session included participants from universities, banks, and other prominent financial and economic organizations. I can provide the committee with a list of the experts who reviewed and validated last year's forecasts. I mention all of this because I want to make it clear that a budget is not prepared within a bubble at the Department of Finance and the Department of Treasury Board. Decisions are made using the professional judgment of the many experts within government and validated using the professional judgments of outside experts. This includes accountants, economists, and a variety of other financial experts. We see this as an important part of the due diligence that goes into producing the provincial budget each year. The Auditor General's report also looked at a number of other very important issues, including financial controls within government and the provincial debt. I'd like to briefly address this issue of Nova Scotia's debt. I know the Finance Minister has said publicly many times that she shares the concerns of the Auditor General and the public about debt. Every government wants to be able to deliver public services, and the interest we pay on our debt each year affects this. But context around the economic conditions that we operate in and the progress we make compared to other provinces is an important part of this important discussion. Nova Scotia's debt has been growing since the 1950s, with the greatest acceleration during the 1980s and the 1990s. Since 2000, this growth has slowed considerably, and recently we've seen years like 2010-11 when the debt was actually reduced. Our staff recently looked at how debt has changed for all provinces during the global economic slowdown, 2008 through to 2012. Only 3 provinces did not see an increase in net debt during this period: Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland. And it's worth noting that both Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador recently introduced significant deficit budgets for 2013. Of the 7 provinces that did see an increase in net debt, Nova Scotia has the lowest percentage increase and the lowest per capita increase. As well, our net debt to GDP ratio remained stable over this period, while many others increased. This ratio is an important indicator of economic health because it illustrates the ability of a province to maintain that debt. The long-term trend of Nova Scotia shows this ratio decreasing. I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to address you at the start of today's meeting. Both Byron and I look forward to discussing the Auditor General's recent report and the work our department is doing to address Mr. Lapointe's concerns and improve our processes. Thank you.
Deputy, thank you very much for your presentation. Our usual practice is to move through the 3 caucuses, offering them equal amount of time to ask questions in a first round, followed by a second round. And we'll start this morning with Mr. Younger from the Liberal Caucus with up to 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. There's obviously a number of issues in the report which relate to your department, and I appreciate you being here. I would like to, I think I'm going to largely start with them in the order that you discussed them. So let's start with the $27 million overstatement or error. I mean, people can call it whatever they want, but the amount I think is largely agreed to. On the day that the finance minister, who's now the member for Fairview, tabled the budget and gave the provincial budget speech in the legislature on April 3rd, 2012, did he and the department know that the budget was inaccurate by $27 million?
I would say that the finance minister of the day knew that there had been a further economic estimate of the 4th quarter data that suggested that the value of the revenues would have been impacted had it been decided to incorporate that. At the time, it was decided that it was not material. It was below the threshold of the Auditor General, and for that decision, or for that reason, it was decided that it would not be incorporated.
How can that possibly be not material? And I say this because, very importantly, in the Minister of Finance of the day's speech, he made it very clear in a centerpiece of that speech, as did the Premier, that the government was exceeding their back-to-balance targets. And so while on a percentage basis, you know, perhaps it is outside of a threshold. However, that $27 million actually meant that the department, or that the government as a whole, was not meeting the back-to-balance targets last year as the finance minister stood up. So how do you define it as not being material when it actually very much affected the principle and the content of the statement that the minister made at the time?
When we build a budget, we work very closely with the Auditor General. They set the materiality
And
threshold.
the Auditor General told you you were wrong.
Actually, if you'll allow me a minute here, what actually happened, and I'd like the opportunity to lay out the process that emerged there. When we put a budget together, there's a lot of variables that go into the calculation of the revenues. In order to accommodate the process of putting a budget together, there has to be a time allowed for the Auditor General here in Nova Scotia to review our assumptions and our numbers. We are the only province in the country that has that process. So we have to identify a cutoff date after which we can't accommodate change. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to accommodate the process that the Auditor General needs to go through and the logistical process of trying to put products together. So realistically, there has to be a date upon which you say, okay, we're going to stop here and we'll develop the budget and approve the revenues and the assumptions and make spending decisions in light of the pool of money we have available. So the date was decided to be March the 1st to allow this whole other process to evolve. The information that came out was after that date, and so it was not incorporated into the assumptions. And I think it's really important to understand that these are estimates and that anything that doesn't get in before the cutoff date will logically be brought in the first quarterly update, which is 5 months later. So it's an evolving process, and I think we need to understand how a budget works so that you understand that there has to be a cutoff date after which you'll have to pick it up in the next reiteration of those numbers.
I understand how a budget works, and from my perspective, well, there's two issues. One, on February 13th, Mr. Lapointe indicated that actually your department was notified by March 1st, and I'm happy to table that quote. In fact, it says it would have been identified by the 1st of March, actually seen by us on February 29th, and we're talking to them the next day. So if your cutoff date was March 1st, the Auditor General stated on February 13th that your office was notified on that date. But even if that hadn't happened, I'll raise two different issues. One, also on that date, so this year's budget is being tabled on the 4th, I think. That is 1 day later than when it was tabled last year, which was April 3rd, and yet, unless this has changed, we understand from the department that the cutoff date is now much, much closer. So this closer cutoff date doesn't seem to be an issue. And even if the cutoff date was an issue, which, fine, I'll even accept the fact that maybe, okay, it's got to get to the Crown printer or whoever to print the documents, I still don't understand why the Minister of Finance, knowing that there's an error or maybe a potential error, on that day, or even in the 4 weeks or so, I think it was about 4 weeks that we sat in this chamber and down in the Red Room and argued this budget, why he wouldn't say to members of the legislature, there may be a revenue oversight in this case. You know, I have seen them do it at the federal level. I've seen them do it in other provinces. I've seen them do it in municipalities across the province where and I've seen it in school boards, whereas they work through their budget process, and after the budget's tabled, people responsible for finance, you know, bring additions and corrections, they bring amendments, all that sort of thing. So there's really, even if it's about having the printed document, I still don't understand why the Minister of Finance would be advised to not let the public know and let the members of the let members of the public know and let especially members of the legislature who are spending 80 hours reviewing the estimates know that there may be a material change, which changes the theme of his entire speech, which was that they were exceeding the back to balance targets, which it turned out they weren't.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, we didn't get the information at the end of February. That wasn't even released until the 2nd of March. It was released by Statistics Canada. That's a publicly known fact. So we didn't have that information when we were working with a deadline of March the 1st. It came out after that. But to your point, it's about the materiality of the number. As I've said, there is a threshold of materiality, and this was well below it. It was 1/3 of 1%. of our revenues. It was considered to be non-material in the overall production of the revenue forecast. And that was a threshold and materiality level decided by the Auditor General. It wasn't our own evaluation that it was material or immaterial. It was, we were working to that, as we do every year. Every year, the Auditor General gives us a materiality threshold under which they say, this is not an issue that we need to accommodate in the budget.
I guess it's all about how you define materiality. Because on April 3rd, the finance minister stood in this House and he said, quote, in the last year's fiscal plan, the deficit for 2012-2013 was projected at $216 million. In this budget, the projected deficit is $211 million. In other words, we are almost exactly where we said we would be at this point in our back to balance plan. And he went on to talk about how, in fact, they were beating it by $5 million, which maybe he certainly thought that beating it by $5 million was material. So how can the department, on the one hand, feel that it was material that the back to balance target was being beat by $5 million on the one hand, but it's not material that, in fact, they were missing it by $21 million, which is 4 times as much as the minister thought was material for beating it?
I would bring you back to the budget process.
Yeah, but I'm not much concerned about the printed document.
No, I'm not
What I'm concerned
talking-
about is the information that's provided to members of the legislature and the fact that we sat around here for 80 hours of debate on a budget, more than 80 hours, but 80 hours in estimates on a budget that it turned out actually the Minister of Finance was sitting across from us and knew was wrong.
From a Department of Finance perspective, there's a process we do go through, and I'm not talking about binding product at that point in time. I'm talking about the evaluation of inputs that go into the revenue forecast. We have some very experienced and knowledgeable individuals in the department who've been working on this this file for the last 15 to 20 years. They've got excellent credentials. When we actually met with the outside economists and discussed the reasonableness of our economic forecast, they were aware as well about the release of this new data and considered it immaterial from their own perspective, felt that our forecast was prudent and cautious from an economic perspective. So in the Department of Finance's own work and leading up to recommendations to the minister, it would have encompassed the thoughts of some very experienced and qualified individuals to say, in the grand scheme of the economic indicators, this is not material.
But do you see the difference between, I think the difference is a materiality from a budget point of view and saying, well, you know, we have a threshold of, you know, 1/3%, whatever that threshold is decided on a given year in cooperation with the Auditor General. And then what the Minister of Finance stands up and says in this House. Did you at any time advise the Minister that he should correct that in his speech or make people aware of that in his speech?
Well, I wasn't there at the time, but the way it works, and I can just speak to that, is that the efforts of the staff who are the experts in this whole area are all fed into the modeling and recommendations on the implications of that on the dollars that the province has to work with are very made known to the minister and in turn made known to Treasury Board. And the recommendations going forward were that the revenues that were being put forward in the budget estimates were prudent and credible and did not, even though they did not reflect the what was considered to be not material. So they made the minister and the Treasury Board very well aware that this was the recommendation, that this was immaterial from their own perspective and from the outside experts. So that's the role of the bureaucrats inside the Department of Finance, is to inform our masters of that. And as a result, we put it forward. We shared it with the Auditor General. The Auditor General gave us a letter validating what we were building into our revenues for the budget. I can table the Auditor General's letter. It was very clear that there was a cutoff It's stated right in the letter, the cutoff was March the 1st. That was before this information came out. It's well known in the Department of Finance that this is an estimate process, that the numbers continue to change. The one thing we do know is that the budget that's tabled will never be what it's going to look like at the end of the day because there's so many variables. There's over 600 variables that go into our economic model. This is one of them. Well, actually, this isn't even one of them because this is a quarter of the year. Our model works off of annualized economic indicators. So this is 1 quarter of 2011. And the implications were determined to be non-material. So.
And I understand that, and perhaps you can understand my concern that it would be one thing if the budget was presented that way and the minister didn't also then stand up in this legislature and trumpet the fact that, you know, all of the numbers showed that they were $5 million ahead of their target when in fact he knew that that was not the case. So would having that information, and I understand that you were not there as the deputy at the time, having that information, would the department have advised the minister, at any time did the department advise the minister not to let the legislature or the public know about the error? Or was that simply a decision that would have been made by cabinet or the minister?
I'm sorry, but I keep going back to you do need to establish a cutoff date for this information.
I agree, but the minister stood up and there's a difference between the cutoff date and the budget and the fact that the minister then stood up and said other things in the legislature. He claimed the government was ahead of their back to balance target when they weren't. And he knew they weren't. I don't much care that the information came on March 2nd, or even if it came, I don't care if it came the day before the budget. He still had an obligation to inform the legislature of the latest information, especially, and I understand that budgets change throughout the year. I've been through enough of them to know that they adjust. I don't dispute that fact. I don't dispute the fact that sometimes there are disputes over numbers and you know, and there's different ways of calculating things. I understand all that. However, at the end of the day, budget speeches have largely become political exercises in not just here, and that's not about this party, the party that's in power, but you just need to look at, you know, the federal budget last week. They are about claims of where, and they are statements of where the province is at a given point in time on that day. And I know those speeches are reviewed and edited sometimes up to minutes before the speech is actually given. And the issue at hand here is that the minister stood and went further than the budget and said, we are exceeding our back to balance claims when in fact they were not. And what I'm wondering is, did anybody in the department advise the minister that he probably shouldn't claim that the government is ahead of its back to balance targets? Because of course, when this information does get adjusted in the budget in the next quarter or whenever, as you said it would be, that's going to be shown that it was false and that he knew it was false. Or is this just an issue of, you know, your job is to give the minister the best information possible? There was the budget target, and then it's up to him how he chooses to present that, or her, as the case may be.
I was just conferring with my colleague who was there.
I know it's tough because you weren't there, but.
I mean, basically, the day before, or 2 days before the budget was presented, the Auditor General reviewed the budget address. He knew that we were going to be working with the cutoff date of March the 1st. All I can say is we would have advised the minister of what we felt was the most realistic revenue forecast and economic assumptions given that cutoff date, and that the additional information that came out in our mind and based on the Auditor General's threshold was immaterial. And knowing again that, now what the minister might have said in the House beyond that, I really can't comment on that.
All right. Treasury Board was obviously informed of the, despite the cutoff date, Treasury Board was obviously informed of this, correct?
Mm-hmm.
On what date did the Department of Finance informed Treasury Board? Obviously, the Minister of Finance, I assume, was told as soon as you knew.
Yes, the
was that
minister,
correct?
that's normally the way it works.
Yeah.
Once the economics, well, the data comes out at the beginning of March, and then the modeling on the economics takes a week to 10 days to complete, and then the fiscal modeling happens. So yes, eventually the minister will know.
You know, this isn't the kind of thing that somebody would have said, oh, we don't need to let the finance minister know about this. I mean,
No.
somebody would have.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's all part of the process.
And then, so when would Treasury Board as a whole have been advised?
That was brought into Treasury Board on the 28th of March.
All right, and why was there a delay if you found out or your department found out on March 2nd? Why would it have taken until March 28th before Treasury Board was advised?
It probably took till about March the 15th or 16th to even finish the model runs to get a handle on what we're talking about in terms of impacts. From then till the 28th, there was only the meeting on the 21st and then the meeting on the 28th. So when you're heading into...
So you're waiting for the meeting?
Sorry?
So they were waiting for the meeting.
Oh yeah, you'd have to get on the schedule for the meeting. And you can appreciate that a few weeks before budget, which is that time frame, it was difficult to get on the agenda.
I can appreciate that, but I also would appreciate, I would have thought this would have been important.
Well, and it was. So it got on as soon as it could get on. So it was only probably about a week and a half after they've assessed what the implications are before it got into the room.
What was the cutoff date for this year?
Well, it was the 19th of March, but it's a different cutoff date that we need to talk about here. Based on the recommendations of the Auditor General, when they were in here in February, they recognized that there was always a cutoff date as it related to the economics, but what was missing was a cutoff date after which we wouldn't be expected to incorporate any non-trivial issues. So the cutoff date on the economics for this year would have been January the 31st. But then and I'll take you through a chart later on, but we acted on the Auditor General's recommendation to institute a second cutoff date beyond which they wouldn't be expecting us to accommodate non-trivial errors, and that's the 19th of March. So
the 27 million is, on the one hand, it's non-material, but on the other hand, it's non-trivial.
Yeah.
Excuse me, the first tranche is over at the moment. We'll move now to Mr. Bailey on behalf of the Conservative Caucus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Ms. Cody, Mr. Rayfuse. Let me just say that I do respect the professionalism of your department. I've seen it in action. I know you're responsible for the compilation of a $9 billion budget, and inevitably there will be errors, large and small, that are unavoidable. I'm not interested in discussing how mistakes happen. I believe Nova Scotians would be very forgiving of mistakes when they're made, or errors when they're made, or estimates that turn out to be wrong when they happen, if they're told about them. And so I would like to just pursue the $27 million and the disclosure or non-disclosure of it, and not the fact that somewhere along the way an error was made. The Auditor General, in his report of February 2013 on page 18, states that the error was significant enough to be corrected. Now, I know we just talked about the accounting concept of materiality, which of course is a term that accountants like to use. But to me, the issue isn't whether it was material according to the accounting definition or not. The issue is whether this $27 million overstatement was significant enough to be disclosed to the owners of the province, which are, of course, the people of the province of Nova Scotia. So the Auditor General found that it was significant enough to be corrected. Do you agree with the Auditor General that this $27 million overstatement was significant enough to be corrected, as he says in his report?
I would say, and I apologize for repeating myself, but I would say you have to go back to process. To put a budget together, as you would know, you need cutoff dates. This was not within the time frame of the cutoff dates. This came after the fact. Even after it was assessed at what it would be worth, and the decision was made not to include it. The Auditor General still approved the revenue estimates, knowing all of this.
And I understand he would do that because it's not material, and according to the accounting definition of materiality, which I'm truly not interested in debating the concept of materiality, you said a decision was made not to include it. Who made that decision?
Well, it would have been a recommendation coming out of the staff after the challenge function, after our own economists evaluated in the context of the overall value of some of these variables, and a recommendation coming forward into the Minister of Finance and through the Minister of Finance into Treasury Board. There would have been a presentation made on the 28th of March which showed them the current estimated value of revenues. It would have alerted them to some of the changes in the economics and the rationale for not making that change to the budget estimate assumptions.
Sorry, so the decision about whether it was significant enough to correct was made by Treasury Board. Is that what I just heard you say?
On the recommendation of the Department of Finance workers.
So you felt it was not significant. You disagree with the Auditor General on whether $27 million is a significant item or not.
Again, we're back to the materiality. That's what we were.
No, we're not. I'm sorry, but we're not talking about materiality. We're talking about whether it's significant. Look, I used to be in your shoes in the corporate world, and the auditors for every private company out there report significant errors to the company's owners, the shareholders, whoever they may be. And then the board or the CEO will decide whether it's significant or not and disclose the difference even if it doesn't meet the accounting test of materiality. I think that's the same test that the Department of Finance and Treasury Board ought to have. So I've asked you if your opinion was whether 27 million is significant, not material, but significant, and who made the decision not to disclose the $27 million. And I think you said Treasury Board, but I just want to make sure that's what you said.
First off, I'd like to go back, if you would indulge me, and have a little conversation about the term error from an accounting perspective. And I know...
An overstatement.
Not necessarily. And I'd like actually to defer to my colleague, Mr. Rayfuse, to explain from in the accounting world what the term error means, because it's out in the general public. People use the word error and mistake quite frequently and interchangeably, and I don't think that that's true.
Just before you do that, I'll ask a related question then, and you can confer. But the Auditor General's report says during his review, he was advised there was an error, these are his words, resulting in a $27 million overstatement of revenue estimates.
Right.
He was advised of that error when he began his review of the assumptions that are in question here.
Which is why I think it's really important to understand what he meant by the word error.
You may want to confer with the Auditor General as well.
For sure, but we'll start here to my left to my current advisor on the accounting.
Mr. Rayfuse.
Good morning. And to be precise, there isn't really a great definition for error when you're looking at forward-looking statements as an estimate or the like. Most definitions of errors pertain to past events, and so there's generally a lack of clarity about what an error means in an accounting sense when you're looking at forward-looking. But the Auditor General would be looking at an error probably in the context of what's defined in PSAP. Around what's prior period errors, and which is less than precise, but looks at things about when things are left out of financial statements that should have been included, or were included and shouldn't have been included, or might have been included and it might have been inaccurate. There's only two places that the Auditor General can really go to characterize something on a review, and is areas of professional judgment, which goes into the area of materiality. And you talked about areas where the auditor and a preparer might have a difference of opinion, and those will lead to what are generally referred to as unadjusted differences, and we don't really have that context on a forward-looking statement like an estimate. So you get into these debates about whether an item is an error or a matter of professional judgment.
All right, thank you, Mr. Rayfuse. I do want to move on. The Auditor General reports in his report on page 18 that he suggested to management at the Department of Finance, which I take to be you guys, that the Executive Council be informed of this known error, and this was done. Can you confirm that that was done, and on what date was that done?
This It's not brought into Executive Council. This was brought into Treasury Board.
Okay, which is a committee of
It's a
the
committee
Cabinet.
of, and that would have been on the 28th of March that we're talking about.
Is it normal that there would be Premier's office staff in attendance at Treasury Board when budget matters are being discussed?
The Premier's office staff,
Yes.
sometimes if they can make it, yes.
So at that meeting where the Treasury Board was informed of the $27 million overstatement, is that the meeting where it was decided that it was significant or not, and whether to disclose it to the people of Nova Scotia or not?
What was decided at that meeting was to approve the revenue estimates that showed up in the budget that didn't include that amount.
And that was known to the Treasury Board because it was your department's responsibility to inform them that there were unadjusted differences, to use Mr. Rafus's term, including a $27 million overstatement of revenue.
That was brought into Treasury Board on the 28th of March.
Right.
So the decision that was made coming out of that meeting was to approve the revenues that were presented that excluded that adjustment.
So your department informed the Auditor General on or around the 1st of March that there was a $27 million overstatement. And I know the number changed for several times during that 2-week period, but who else was informed about this potential significant overstatement between the 1st of March and the date the Treasury Board decided not to disclose it?
As I've said, we didn't know the value of this adjustment at the beginning of March. We just got the data on the 2nd of March. It took 2 to 2.5, 3 weeks to do the modeling run. So it was probably not until about the 15th or 16th of March that our modeling had been finished at that point in time. So
you told the Auditor General, and who else was informed of the error or the misstatement that was uncorrected?
I would have expected that the staff would probably have approached the deputy of the day and advised.
The Deputy of Finance?
Yes.
Would it be normal to also inform Premier's office staff, the Deputy of the Premier, Chief of Staff, others that are involved in the budget process, that there was a potential $27 million overstatement in the budget?
Not normally, because it fell under the materiality threshold. And we were dealing with the Auditor General's staff at the time and sharing this information after the modeling was completed. You wouldn't necessarily run to the Premier's office and tell them about number changes if they were falling under a materiality threshold.
Do
No.
Premier's office staff attend budget meetings, whether they're Cabinet or Treasury Board?
Sometimes, if they can. If they're not always, but sometimes they're there, yeah.
In your professional opinion, is the decision whether to disclose a significant but not material item a departmental decision, or is it a political decision?
Disclose it to
the people of Nova Scotia.
Again, from a department's perspective, our mandate and our goal is to inform our political masters.
Which you did.
Which we did.
And at that Treasury Board meeting that you referred to earlier,
Right.
It was decided by the political level that it would not be disclosed at the time of the budget.
In fairness, I don't think the witness said that.
No.
But
That's why I'm
could you-
asking it.
So could you repeat the question, please?
Well, Ms. Cody, you've said several times it was decided that it wouldn't be disclosed or that the budget
No.
wouldn't be changed. I'm
Actually,
wondering,
what I
again, who made that decision? Was it
What-
you? Was it your department? Was it
No.
Mr. Rafuse? Was it Treasury Board? Was it the Premier? Who decided not to change the budget? I don't think I can put it any clearer than that.
But I think there's a different question that you're asking. You're asking who decided not to disclose it. What I'm saying is the Department of Finance made a recommendation not to incorporate it.
Yes.
Which is different. Because it did not meet the materiality threshold, that's why.
Okay, but it may well meet the threshold of best practices in disclosure to tell the people who rely on the budget that it's wrong, even if it's not wrong in the accounting materiality sense, but it's still wrong. And who made that decision?
I can't answer that question.
But your department reported the $27 million overstatement to Treasury Board, and they did decide on that date to go forward
They decided,
with the budget as is.
yes, with the revenue estimates excluding that amount, yes.
And Premier's office staff are in attendance for important Treasury Board meetings that involve the final compilation of the budget?
I can't say that for sure. I'd have to go back and look at the attendees in place because they're busy people at that time of year too, so I can't tell you
Is
for
there
sure.
something more important on March the 28th than the presentation of the estimates to the people of Nova Scotia? That's it's not a question. That probably is fair. So we'll leave that one. We'll leave that one out there. Ms. Cody, on April 2nd at 7:10 p.m., there were 5 pages of the assumptions to the budget changed at the request of your department. That's well after every cutoff date that you've listed for us today or previously. Why is it okay to make those changes but not to change the $27 million overstatement?
I'm not aware of what the change content was on those pages. Sometimes at the last minute, as anybody who's been in government knows, sometimes there are last minute changes. Sometimes it's because the government of the day makes a decision to pursue or to implement a budget measure. You can't announce a budget measure if you don't accommodate it and account for it in the budget. So there have been times in the past where there have been those last minute changes because, like I said, if you don't have the fiscal costing of a particular measure in the budget, you can't really announce it. In this particular case, it's not that we didn't have an economics forecast in the budget. It was the assumptions around it and the key cutoff dates. And I think reality is this is an estimate, and we know very clearly that that estimate will continue to evolve, and the next opportunity would be the first quarter to change that. So in order to accommodate the production, or not just the production, I'm not talking about that in the context of products, I'm talking about that in the context of decisions on spending. In order to facilitate that, you have to have a cutoff date.
Your cutoff date, I'm sorry, you said earlier, was March the 1st, I think.
Yes.
Your department was inviting submissions from Nova Scotians for that particular budget up until the 16th of March. Was that a false consultation with Nova Scotians because you had already established a cutoff date?
No, not at all, actually. You have to have a sense of what your fiscal plan is in order to finalize your expenditure. So I'm not saying that the expenditure decisions were all made at the beginning of March. I'm saying that defining what the true value of your revenue pool that you have available to fund decisions as part of your budget has to be established early in the game so that you know the decisions you can afford to make. So that doesn't mean that you can't consider and accommodate decisions that you may hear through that month.
So you could make changes at least up until that date. And as we know from our own Freedom of Information request, changes were made to the budget documents. In particular, the assumptions, which is actually what we're discussing here this morning, as late as 7:10 p.m. on April 2nd. Who decides what changes are okay to make at the last minute and which ones are not?
You know, that's a really interesting and important question because the ability to accommodate changes at the last minute like that differs depending on the significance of changes or how extensive they permeate throughout all the budget products. If you have a one number change as a true error and you need to correct that, that's easier to do than to go back into all the pieces and layers of a budget that's been put together to re-examine.
So the Auditor General says in his report, all information was available to support the change in sufficient time to revise the estimates. Do you agree with his finding in his report on that?
That's a difficult question to answer. I also heard him say you could do it in a day. And I think that's totally unrealistic. So it depends on what government was prepared to do, or if government was prepared to do anything, the extent to which they wanted to accommodate it. Knowing that the Auditor General didn't feel it was material and that they weren't going to change things at that point in time, I think that's kind of that's a question I can't answer.
Well, let me ask the Auditor General, if I may, Mr. Chair. would it be, in your opinion, as an accounting professional, best practice to change a public document when you know it contains an overstatement of $27 million, even if that amount is significant but not meeting the definition of accounting materiality?
Well, to answer that, I should point out that this concept of materiality is merely a number that we use to determine whether or not we would qualify our opinion on the financial statements or the budget after it is issued. And the number in this case was approximately $90 million. We take the view and have stated many times that regardless of that, all non-trivial errors that are found during the auditor review process should be corrected, and made that recommendation. We made the recommendation on the 15th that all these errors should be corrected. So, and in fact, the numbers had been run by the department at that time through the model in order to calculate the impact. This is, you understand, a number of different little changes in inputs, in errors, and other types of economic changes that work their way through the models to come up with a financial number at the end. That had been worked out by the department on the 12th and presented to us.
Thank you.
The March 1st cutoff, I may add, was not a cutoff. That was the date at which of the assumptions approval that we used for our opinion.
So if I understand you correctly, this whole concept of materiality is only a guide, not a guide, it's only a principle used to assist you in reaching an opinion on whether the estimates, the revenue estimates, are compiled in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles. But separate from that is the issue of disclosure to the public of an accurate set of estimates, accurate to the best of the department's and the government's ability. And in the area of disclosure, as separate from accounting, would it be appropriate for a government to report significant errors, or in fact not report them, but to correct its estimates no matter what date they come to light, in order to properly inform the public of the state of the province's finances?
I don't think I can, I'm in a position to say what is appropriate or not appropriate for a government to disclose. We were reviewing the documents. We did feel, however, that the amount should be disclosed at some point.
Excuse me.
That's why we reported ourselves.
Thank you. The second tranche of questioning is finished now. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Is it Mr. Wynot?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and glad to have the witnesses in today to discuss some very important issues around the Auditor General's report. Mr. Chair, I certainly find it ironic, the political rhetoric coming from the Liberal Party, in particular around their decisions in the 90s around P3 contracts, their decisions around borrowing $650 million to pay off health authorities and the debt that they had, and in fact their $500 million worth of platform commitments in the 2009 election, all of which they probably wouldn't be able to do. And also remind Nova Scotians that the vast majority of the debt that we have in this province are because of the Conservatives and the Liberals. Ms. Cody, you, I understand you've been around the Department of Finance and Treasury Board for a number of years.
Yes.
And in fact, I understand your entire career.
Yes.
Pretty close, okay. Could you please, let's take a step back here and just walk us through the process of preparing a budget and exactly what that entails, starting from the very beginning of when the budget documents begin to be pulled together.
Certainly, thank you. Just have a few notes on this,
Sure.
Just to keep my thoughts together. The budget process itself really starts in earnest in the fall. With the, at that point in time, you're in a pretty good place to update the revenues and the spending since the budget was tabled. So that's the first time you really have a chance to have a good look at your fiscal plan. And so in the fall, in October, November, you're working on your capital decisions on the budget. Recommendations are going into Treasury Board on the size of the dollars for capital spending that you might have available in the upcoming year, and the projects that are already underway or new ones that are on the docket to be considered. Those decisions are made through the October, November, and in the last few years, they have released a report in December advising Nova Scotians about what their upcoming year's budget will look like as it relates to capital. It's not actually voted on until the spring with the regular budget. So after the capital is completed, or behind the scenes at the same time, we're working closely with the departments to get a sense of how they're tracking on their spending levels for the current year, and basically given targets for what the upcoming year's expenditure levels for those particular departments are likely to be, and being asked for the implications of those targets on their departments. So by December, January, you're looking for the departments to report back into Treasury Board on what the implications of certain spending levels on the department will be. You're also receiving more revenue information as it relates to your income taxes coming out of Ottawa. You would have received your estimate of equalization just prior to Christmas on the upcoming year. So things are starting to shape up. You're starting to get a better feel for what your fiscal plan for the upcoming year is going to look like. And as we proceed through January and February, the departments are getting a sense from the Treasury Board as to what they feel they're going to be able to accommodate. This year was an exception, but normally you'd also see the federal budget come down by the third week in February. So you'd have a sense of how that's going to impact you. So as we go through the February period, as we've been talking about, you're getting a sense of those economic indicators. You're starting to re-estimate your revenue picture so that you can help to update your fiscal plan for the upcoming year for Treasury Board. And so once you get through the February period, you're really down into close to final decisions on spending. Now you have a better sense of what your fiscal numbers are looking like. You've updated your revenues based on your economics. And so basically you're getting final decisions made. Once, as that's happening and as you're close to final, you're already starting production of certain budget documents. You're starting to document what your key assumptions are that you're building behind your revenue stream, your economic assumptions, and you're starting to work those things through even your liability management, your debt borrowing. And so when the final decisions are made, which is close to, I'd say, the third week in March, that on the spending side, you are able to start to lock down what your budget numbers are finally looking to be and starting to produce in final form some of your documentation.
So there are two things that I want to take out of what you just said. One was around capital expenditures and the decision to put out or release a copy of the capital plan prior to Christmas, prior to December, usually in November, my understanding. Why, I mean, I know in the past it's always been, you know, let's wait until the budget's passed. Why is that such an important thing? Why is that such an important release of information to the public?
It's important because it signals to the construction sector the kind of projects that we're going to be looking at, and clearly the building and that whole construction period in Nova Scotia is very short, given the weather and the restraints around all that. So it was determined a few years back that it would be much more feasible to release the plans in advance so that the construction sector can start to get ready and be prepared so that when it's all final and approved, we've got everything out of the gate as quickly as possible.
The other thing you mentioned was about spending levels. And so in the last 3 years, am I correct in saying that every department, except for a few, because of some purchases in land, my understanding, has come in under budget every year for the last 3 years?
Yep. Yes.
Has that happened in recent history?
Well, since the government came into place and the decision was made to get back to balance, and the expenditure management plan has been launched, all the government departments have been pursuing with a lot of rigor how it can achieve increased efficiencies and savings.
Great.
So in past, many periods past, not always, definitely there'd be more and more dollars being looked to. But given the importance and the significance of reaching the balanced budget, they've definitely been really focusing on how they can achieve those cost savings and coming in under budget.
You talked about the process here in Nova Scotia. Can you talk about the differences between our pre-budget process compared to other provinces? Just because, I mean, we have to know what other provinces do. I think Nova Scotians need to know. And my understanding that some of our processes are much different than other provinces.
Right. I can tell you what I know.
Sure.
I do know that we are the only province in the country that has the Auditor General come in and look at our assumptions on economics and on revenues to review the reasonableness of them. It's not an audit. It's looking at them in the context of what do you know and is it reasonable? We're the only province that goes through that. All the other provinces have cutoff dates, since we're talking about cutoff dates, and we've been looking at how close to budget those cutoff dates are, and I think it's important to note. And I can just run down for the provinces that we're aware of. Newfoundland and Labrador, there's 2 weeks before their budget, they lock everything down. New Brunswick, 3 weeks. Quebec, 2 months. Ontario, 3 weeks. Alberta, 5 weeks. And British Columbia, 2 months. So prior to their tabling their budget, these were their lockdown dates. In our case, we have our lockdown date, but then we have the Auditor General's process on top of that. And the Auditor General's office needs 20 days to do their work. So after we've locked down our cutoff date, you have to account for 20 days to ensure that they have the opportunity to go through and evaluate. So that's why when you lock it down on March the 1st, you're according the Auditor General the period of time in the month of March to do their work, and so that we can have some confidence in the numbers that we're coming out with. In addition to that, and I don't know to the extent other provinces do this, we have a real challenge function on our economic forecast. Over the years, that's changed. It used to be, it's going on for, I want to say 15 years, but it's a long time. It used to be that we would contact these outside economists and invite them in to meet with the minister prior to budget, probably about 3 to 4 weeks before budget. And we would want to hear what their forecasts of our economy were looking like, and nationally. Over the last few years, there's been a whole lot more rigor built into that whole process, where now, and I had the opportunity in this year to sit in on the one, things have changed a lot. We've actually shared with them in advance, under a signed document of confidentiality, the details around the economic forecast, and they have them to scrutinize. It used to be we were asking what their forecast was. Now they have access to the details of our forecast. And so when we meet with them, they would have already studied the ins and outs of our forecast, and then we present it to them, and then they challenge us on it. Or they say it looks reasonable and consistent with what they think is in store for the economy. So I don't know the extent to which other jurisdictions do that function, but we find it to be extremely beneficial. And in this case, they agreed that what came out in terms of data at the last minute last year was immaterial to the overall picture of the province.
So when we talk about the challenge session, how many different organizations and different organizations are involved? And who? And can you tell us who?
Actually, I could table it. I have it right here.
Great.
If we'd like to table it.
Sure.
But we have different banks: Bank of Montreal, the Bank of Nova Scotia, the CIBC. We have Conference Board. We have Acadia. We have some academics too, Acadia. Dalhousie, St. Mary's, we have the Royal Bank, St. FX, the TD Bank, we have APEC. We have a whole host of folks, both academic, private sector. These are the economists who forecast for us and for the country as a whole, and we bring them all in. We either bring them in, or this year we had them on conference call. Those from Toronto, they didn't come down, but they're all very, very engaged in the whole process.
Sounds pretty rigorous process involved to bring those other people in from outside to talk about that. I understand that the department has taken what the Auditor General has said in his report and have begun a process from here on in to change the process that has happened in the past. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Actually, if I might, I could table another product.
Sure.
Which is, and actually I have copies, I don't know if you want to have them now before I talk about it, but it lays out the timelines for this year. This was one of the recommendations in the auditor's report in February, that we need to have a clear schedule to work from, that we're both, I do actually.
Thank you. The multiple copies will be handed out.
But what it does is lays out kind of what, for this year's budget, where we were, where we started the journey on the January the 25th. It shows the cutoff for those economic assumptions. And the fact as it works through January and into February, this is the economics that the staff would be gathering from Statistics Canada releases through the month of January. It would be factoring those indicators into the economic models. And then mid-February, it's transferring those to the revenue forecasting models. So basically, this first part, the January 25th to the February 22nd, it shows you the whole process that goes through between the economic and fiscal modeling. On February the 25th, in terms of deliverables to the Auditor General, the economic input is relayed to the Auditor General from the first materials that we were using on our cutoff of January the 25th. There was only one extra piece that came out, and this is the data that came out last year that's in question, the March 1st and the March 4th to the 5th. This was the 2012 fourth quarter economic data that was factored into our modeling. By March the 1st, it came out. It was our Nova Scotia labor income, the Canadian GDP data, and it was received by our staff at the Economic and Statistics Group. On the 4th, we got additional residential construction investment data that's been also factored into our model. In conversation, or not conversation, but discussion with the Auditor General, we agreed that the incorporation of this data by the 4th and the 5th would be the cutoff for this year for the economic data going into the 13-14 budget. That's the economic data. So then that economic data, after it's run through the models, gets turned over to the fiscal modeling group. And so, as you will see going through the timetable on the next page, by the 8th, the revised economic assumptions are completed and worked through to the fiscal models, and so that's the cutoff on the fiscal models. So now we have two cutoffs, the 4th for the economic, the 8th for the fiscal, and then there's one more cutoff. Now we're on to the 19th cutoff. So that gives the Auditor General time to receive all this information from our staff, to analyze it, pour through it, and ensure that the assumptions are valid and they're in keeping with the data that's come out on the economy, and the fiscal models are in keeping with the economic information. So now it's been decided, and this is the new piece for this year that's never been done before, the cutoff on the 19th for reaching and recording all non-trivial errors. So after the 19th, according to this schedule, there will be, if the Auditor General does come upon a significant non-trivial issue, this deadline has stopped the clock there. So now we're into the production processes as opposed to revisiting our models. And anyways, that's the process. So so what we've done this year's first, and I want to draw your attention down the bottom of the timelines and deliverables. There's a reference on the bullet 3. These are the errors that are being defined by the Auditor General when we talk about incorporating errors. They're inaccurate inputs, or not using updated economic data received after that cutoff of March the 4th, or not using updated fiscal data on inputs received as of March the 8th. So if they're there before the 4th and if they're there before the 8th, you've got to include them. If you don't, they're going to consider that an error. If it's after, it's a different story and other identified.
What you mentioned about the final revenue estimates provided to the Office of the Auditor General on the 19th, according to this schedule,
yeah.
How does that differ from last year? What was the date for that from last year?
Well, as you will see in this product, which I can table, it's the Auditor General's letter from last year. And if I might read here, basically, actually I don't know that. The estimates of revenue for the fiscal year ending March 31st are the responsibility of the Department of Finance and have been prepared by departmental management using assumptions with an effective date of March the 1st, 2012 or earlier. So that's the comparable date for last year.
Fair enough. So also in your package here, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the Auditor General a question. You've seen this updated schedule, and you agree with it?
Certainly, as you can see, in fact, they have attached an email in which I responded that it was acceptable to us and was reasonable.
So in your email, you state for listing of key dates with respect to the revenue estimates and tabling of estimates as attached timeline and dates indicated are reasonable and are perfectly satisfactory for my office review of the revenue estimates. Regards, yourself. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Right.
Thank you. If that's an end to the questioning from the NDP Caucus, we now move through the second round of questioning. I think we have enough time for 14 minutes for each caucus. So, Mr. Younger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll see how good your math is now. Let me first say that, of course, the member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, forgot in his list of things that he thought should be considered was the fact that the current government, the NDP government, has added more debt faster than any other government in Nova Scotia history. So he forgot that. He probably ran out of time and didn't have time to mention that at the end of that. So I'm sure that if they were given the chance, which I doubt people will, to stay in power longer, they could far exceed any other government in history's record for adding debt, and probably in a faster time as their current rate is shown. And has been noted by a number of independent groups, incidentally. I would like to start by. I think I'd like to start by following up on something my colleague was asking about earlier. And this is for Mr. Lapointe, the Auditor General. You had stated in the Herald, and I was just looking to see if I had that exact quote, which I think I do here somewhere, so I'll find it in a second, that you felt that there was no reason that the most up-to-date information couldn't be and shouldn't be included in a government's budget, and that was the reason for your recommendation in your report. Was that an accurate reflection?
Yes, that's correct. We had recommended on, I believe, the 15th of March that the changes all be made. And we felt it was reasonable at the time that they could be.
Okay, thank you. And I'm wondering from the Department of Finance's point of view, I mean, this is it's great that you've implemented this year. In practical terms, the reason that the Auditor General's report made the recommendations they did is they felt that this is what you should have been doing last year, right? Is that fair? I mean, I know you're doing it this year, and that's fabulous, but...
The reality is, the budget process is an evolving process, and so we get better as we go. And we've been building upon recommendations of the Auditor General for a long time now. So yes, this is an improvement for us, and we are more than happy to work with the Auditor General's office to deliver on this for this year.
So this $27 million, there's a March 19th date for the cutoff of recording all non-trivial errors. Would this have, if this was this year, would that have been a non-trivial error?
Well, we'd have to see what the Auditor General would say about that. Is it under his materiality threshold or not? I mean, that's who we would look to define what's a non-trivial error.
Well, maybe I'll ask the Auditor General. Like, if this had been last year and we had this in place, would this be? We've decided it's a non-material error. Would this be a non-trivial error?
Yes, I should reiterate that materiality is irrelevant for correcting of errors. It has to do with whether or not we qualify our opinion. And, we're looking at a much higher
I appreciate
threshold.
that. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of a non-trivial error, yes, we would consider this to be, if this was occurring this year, a non-trivial error. We considered it a non-trivial error last year and considered that there was time to correct it.
Okay. Thank you. And I think that's important because we've heard the Premier and the Minister of Finance and the Department of Finance say, well, the Auditor General gave us an unqualified opinion, and I don't think that means that the $27 million wasn't important, as you pointed out. That just meant that it was under the threshold that would qualify the opinion. So we've established that this would be non-trivial. Hypothetically, now hopefully this process eliminates these options, but if we had a $27 million, if somebody found out something next week, I know the federal budget, more information comes from the federal budget, and we find that there's going to be a shift in transfer payments of, $20 million or something like that. You might not be able to change the budget by next Thursday. Is that something that you would bring forward as a last-minute amendment or something that you would, as you did with a number of items last year, as my colleague noted? Or would you, at the very least, suggest that the Minister of Finance make the legislature aware of an impact like that comes up at the last minute?
Well,
I'm just wondering what your advice to the Minister would be.
Clearly
it's her choice whether she would take it, obviously.
Absolutely. And so if we found out, but clearly we're past the 19th, this year's key cutoff date, and we know the federal budget's out the door, and we know our numbers, so that's not an issue realistically. But if we were aware that there was something that came out afterwards, we'd certainly make her aware of it, for sure. Whether we would factor it into the numbers is a totally different question.
Yeah, and I think there is a difference between factoring it into the numbers that we see on the page and a Minister of the Crown making the public aware. To me, there is a difference. You can say, listen, this is going to be corrected and we've heard this before in previous governments. Mm-hmm. This is not out of the blue or some new process. We have seen governments of various stripes and governments at different levels say, listen, there's going to be a correction or an adjustment in the numbers leading forward. We see it in the private sector all the time. You see it in their market guidance saying, there's going to be a correction. This is the numbers that we had on the cutoff date. They have the same sort of thing that you just read to the member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville, where it said, these are the numbers as of March 1st. Well, you see that all the time in the private sector and publicly traded companies where they say, this is it, but by the way, there will be an adjustment coming forward because we had layoffs or, whatever. Or there's an amortization expense or all kinds of things like that. In terms of the process, we've heard that it went to the Treasury Board on the 28th. The Treasury Board made a decision. Maybe there were people from the Premier's office there, maybe there weren't. We know from the Freedom of Information request that those minutes were passed to the Premier's office, whether there was somebody at that meeting or not. To follow up on because my colleague had run out of time on this, at the end of the day, the decision on the budget is made by Treasury Board, but it's also made by the whole cabinet, correct?
In terms of the process, these kinds of decisions are made in Treasury Board. So that's their mandate, that's their job. They make those decisions around spending and details around assumptions and revenue levels. That's their job. I mean, clearly government...
The cabinet would have to be advised. I mean, you can't have ministers walking around not realizing that,
right,
we're $27 million short, we've got to find.
I guess my point I was trying to make is you don't then take it all in and go in through all the detail and would expect the cabinet would then supersede Treasury Board. I mean, that's their mandate, is to make those kind of decisions and then bring it in and inform government, the rest of the government members, as to what the budget looks like.
But one would expect that the cabinet and the premier, as a member of the cabinet, would be aware of that. I mean, I can't imagine, well, that there's an error in the budget before it's presented.
Again, back to the error issue. It's about materiality, and does the premier get alerted to every change in the details? I don't know. I can't imagine that he would. Frankly, I'm sure he's a very busy man. But
this is a pretty big change. I mean, this means that you're not meeting the targets.
In terms of materiality?
But it's a non-trivial error.
Well,
really, like, this is important enough an error, or we want to call it an error. This is an important enough of an adjustment that it has now been determined that even on your new schedule, that on March 19th it would now be included.
These are estimates. We can't forget that. These are estimates that will continue to change.
Of course they will, but you want the best estimates possible.
And the next opportunity, definitely it would be brought in. If it's still real, it was still real by that time, because there's a lot of other factors that will change and maybe mitigated by the time the first quarter report comes out in September. But if in fact was still
But actually, in this case, so okay, well, let's get to that. It can change, but in this case, is it not true that by the time we actually hit December, the revenue numbers were actually even worse than that, right? They were down by, I think, doing it by memory, so it was like $90 million or something. Yeah. It wasn't even 27 by that point.
But for different reasons.
Oh, I know it was for different reasons, but what I'm saying, it can go both ways.
It can definitely go both ways, absolutely. I've seen it. So in
the end, the day the budget was presented, we knew it was out by 27, and then it actually got worse than that, and that by the time December, and I'm not suggesting they would have known it was going to be out by 90 million, don't get me wrong, but what I'm saying is that it can go both ways. It could have got better too, but
that's all I was trying to say.
And all I'm saying is that I think that when you present the estimates, or the minister presents the estimates to the legislature and to the public, they should be the absolute best estimates that they're aware of. And even if they're aware of something on that very day, we go through and vote on every line, or not line item, but we vote on every department's estimates. One of the members of the government passes or moves a motion both in here, and they do it in the other room, saying these are the right estimates. So let me give you an example. The Minister of Finance, and if I remember correctly, was in the red. Those estimates were in the red room. I don't think they were there for very long, because it's usually not as many questions. But the Minister of Finance, or their surrogate, would have moved a motion in the red room saying, approve our revenue estimate for this section of the budget. And so they were actually moving a motion on that they knew was wrong. Is that not?
Perhaps I could ask Byron to speak to this.
Yeah, actually, he was probably there.
Just talk.
Mr. Ray.
They need to turn your mic on. Yeah.
Just a clarification, I think the appropriation, the resolutions are only on the expenditure side. There's not a resolution for the revenues.
Okay, so that was the motion in here.
The motion in the House would be to approve the Department of Finance's expenses.
All right, and I stand corrected on that, and thank you. But at the end of the day, so it wasn't in the, I think actually now that you say that, I think you're probably right. But in here, we still voted on something that, fine, we voted against it, but that's immaterial. The fact of the matter is that, we're sitting here making suggestions saying, well, you say you have this much money. And I think where the problem is now we have a budget coming next Thursday. And frankly, nobody knows if the person sitting in the finance minister's chair will tell us if they found out something the night before, even if they can't change the document. And I don't much care whether the document's changed. I don't know whether they would tell us. And I'm not sure how, and I guess this is the question, is how are members of the public in Nova Scotia, or, because forget about members of the legislature, how is somebody out in the public supposed to have faith in the fact that, you know, it just isn't a budget that, you know, they hope there'll be, somebody hopes there'll be an election before the next Auditor General's report comes out, and, you know, so it won't matter. Or they'll find a way to make up for that. I just wondering how, like, it is a question. It's how does one have faith after knowing that people seem to think it's okay that nobody was advised, despite, because I don't think people care about the fact that it came in on March 2nd. They're still wondering why somebody would stand up in a speech and say, oh yeah, we're meeting this, when they knew we actually probably weren't.
I think probably we have a whole lot more process to protect against that than any other province in the country. So if we have our Auditor General going through this whole process with the rigor.
Right, I agree, you have the Auditor General going through the whole
Yeah.
process, and he sat there and he said,
Yeah.
on the 15th, you really should make this change, but you didn't follow it. So, I mean, at the end of the day.
Let's talk, your question was about this year. Let's talk
Yeah,
about
all
this
right.
year, okay? Let's assume we're working towards a positive resolution to the Auditor General's review of our revenues this year and our economic assumptions. And so now that we have this added cutoff deadlines and all that process built in response to the Auditor General's recommendation, I would say with confidence we have more credibility to the Nova Scotians than many other jurisdictions do, who have nobody asking the kind of questions that the Auditor General asks when they put their revenue picture together.
We're finished into this round. Thank you for the questions and the answers. We move to Mr. Bailey, 14 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to switch gears for just a moment and then come back to this topic, but I do want to ask a few questions about the upcoming budget. Ms. Cody, in your introductory remarks, you indicated that you have gone through the Auditor General's February report and that your department is implementing his recommendations. I think you said all of them. One of them, which is recommendation 2.1, is that the Department of Finance should include all revenues of the consolidated entity, including all agencies' third-party revenues for the 2013-14 budget. In previous years, the health authorities and school boards and others are not consolidated or not included in the estimates. They are in the public accounts. But in order for the Auditor General to provide a clean opinion in the future, he has made this recommendation for this upcoming year. Is that one of the recommendations your department is implementing this year?
I'd like to turn to Byron to talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me, just before we get the answer to this, let me note that we're straying onto territory that is somewhat ambiguous as to propriety, but I'm sure the controller will keep in mind that disclosure of budget items in advance of its presentation in the House is not appropriate.
Mr. Chair, all I'm asking is if they're implementing the Auditor General's recommendation.
I understand the question. I'm just noting
I don't want to know if our
where we
taxes
are
are going up and down. I can wait for the day, but I think I'd be interested to hear the answer.
If you recall that the government did commission a study that looked at 4 options to address this recommendation, and one of those options has been explored with the Office of the Auditor General and will be included in this year's revenue assumption. Will be a listing of third-party revenues or revenues that entities that we consolidate that they receive from outside the provincial sources. As per that recommendation, we're hoping that qualification aspect of the Auditor General's opinion will be removed, and that will lead to a clean audit opinion on all the revenues.
For this upcoming year?
For this upcoming year.
And what effect will that have on the budget, the consolidation of these health authorities and school boards and others on the revenue estimates?
It will have no effect on the revenues. If you recall, the way in which the government previously reported these items, we made an assumption that these revenues were offset by equal amount of expenditures and was concluded or included in the estimates for the consolidating adjustment line. what we've decided to do to accommodate this recommendation is these revenues are now listed and a separate report that will be shown in the assumptions document, but they are not added to the revenues of the government. And the reason for that is that they do not support expenditures coming out of the general revenue fund, and wouldn't it be appropriate to include those revenues in that perspective? But we do include them in the total revenues of the government.
So for the estimates, they won't be included in the general revenue fund. I understand that, but in the line item related to consolidated entities like the health authorities and school boards, what effect will this change have on the budget overall?
It will have no effect at all, because these amounts are based on the revenues these entities would have received in the past with known adjustments. These entities continue to receive these revenues as they have in the past. They use them to support expenditures that are not supported by grants or other amounts coming out of appropriations out of the general revenue fund. So they're there for information purposes. They don't affect the revenues of those organizations. They don't affect the revenue of the province, because we always did include these when we reported our consolidated public accounts. They were always included in as our revenues. They're there for information purposes and doesn't expand the expenditure base of the province at all.
At the same time, are there any accounting rule changes recommended by the Financial Accounting Standards Board or other boards that will take effect in the 2014 estimates around tangible capital assets, intergovernmental transfers that do affect the revenues of the consolidating entities?
There are two changes in accounting standards which do affect the entities of which we consolidate. Those actually came into effect in the fiscal year 12-13. Those would be the ones around government transfers and the way in which organizations treat those government transfers. And then the other one would be around the underlying accounting principles which these entities use. Previously, organizations like the district health authorities followed what were called the not-for-profit rules. Not-for-profit rules do not exist anymore, and so those entities, government not-for-profit organizations, were directed towards public sector accounting rules that came into effect in the current year. As far as the impact of those two changes, they will impact those entities' statements and how they report, particularly around capital transfers and whether or not they defer them or not. But on a consolidated basis for the province, it has no impact, because we would have eliminated those differences when we consolidated these entities to convert them essentially to PSAP anyway, even though they would have been reporting as individuals on a different basis.
And you do that when you actually prepare the public accounts, I understand, but for the purpose of the 13-14 estimates, this will be the first year that those accounting changes, the two that you spoke of, would be part of the estimate process. So will they be part of the estimate process for this year?
Yes, the impact of those changes are incorporated into the estimates.
And what is that impact in dollar terms?
The impact would be negligible, because we reported on a consolidated basis. And since those impacts were eliminated previously, there should be no impact. The impact would be on the individual statements and how they report those transactions.
Did your department or your office provide any direction to the health authorities and school boards and others about how they're to account for these changes to governmental transfers and capital assets?
Certainly for the school boards, there was little direction to give them. They were already following public sector accounting rules anyway. For the health authorities, there was or as there is for all the government not-for-profit organization, there was a possibility to use a portion of the previous not-for-profit rules, and so it was PSAP plus a portion of it, and we gave them direction to go directly to PSAP and not to hang on to a portion of the old not-for-profit rules. They would have had to convert in 2 years anyway, and we decided to get them to do it immediately.
Would those changes make it easier for the budget to ultimately be balanced when it's presented next week?
Actually, we should have no impact on the balance or not to balance. It's really since the budget is presented in on a consolidated perspective anyway, the impact should be eliminated.
Will you be presenting estimates under both the old rules and the new rules if there is a difference?
We don't actually present the the budgets for the health authorities. What is presented in the estimates is the grants that the Department of Health give those entities, and so that won't change. It won't have it. It won't be a, there won't be a presentation impact. If anything, it would come through that consolidated adjustment line, and for the most part, we believe that to be minimal.
Could you provide us with a copy of the direction that you did give to the health authorities and others around how to account for these changes?
Certainly, I can confront the committee that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I do want to go back to the $27 million, if I may, Mr. Chair. The Auditor General, in an answer a few moments ago, stated that materiality is irrelevant for the correcting of errors, that errors, when they're known, ought to be corrected. I believe that your advice to the Treasury Board was that it's not material, which concerns me since that's not really the point. I do take your point that we have to judge whether an error is significant or not, and I do just have to say for the record that who decides whether it's significant or not, whoever made that decision should make it based on what the users of the estimates consider to be significant. The users of the estimates are the people of Nova Scotia, ultimately, who rely on them to know what the state of the province's finances is. And I just want to assure everyone, $27 million is significant by any typical Nova Scotian's definition. $270 would be significant to a lot of Nova Scotia families today. So I want to return to the very basic question, who ultimately decided not to change the budget in time to present it to the people of Nova Scotia, and or who decided that $27 million was not significant?
I think that question goes to the deputy, is it?
Yes.
Okay, I thought I've answered this, but I'll try again. The recommendation on whether it was material, we deal with the materiality when we're dealing with producing economic and revenue forecasts. We deal closely with what the Auditor General's materiality clauses are saying. We did not feel that it was material, and so our recommendation on our revenue forecast and revenue assumptions, once we discussed that as well with our external challenge, was it's immaterial. We made them aware of the implications.
I'm sorry, who is them in this case?
Government.
And more specifically than that?
Treasury Board.
And more specifically than that?
All the members who were in the room at the time. I'm sorry, I don't have the attendance record for who was in the room at the time, but it would have been the finance minister, it would have been the chair, and I'm not sure who else at that time.
Were there any others besides Treasury Board that you made this information known to?
Finance would have made it known to the finance minister and the relevant staff would have gone into Treasury Board on the 28th and made that presentation to the Treasury Board room. So the ministers of Treasury Board. That's as far as finance would have taken it.
So when you say we made the recommendation and they decided, they is the Treasury Board, the Committee of Cabinet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
They made the decision to accept the recommended revenue estimates.
That their job, with all due respect, is to decide whether to accept the recommendation or not. And they should be guided by whether $27 million is significant to the ultimate users of the information, which is the people of Nova Scotia. They decided, apparently, to not make the change, and secondly, not to disclose the change for political purposes. Because, as has been pointed out, they had a wish to communicate wrongly, as it turned out, that they were on track, when in fact they were not on track. And I say this with respect to you and Mr. Rafuse because that is not a departmental decision to make, that's a political decision to make. And either they decided it wasn't significant, which puts them offside with every single Nova Scotian who would consider $27 million to be significant, or it puts them offside with appropriate disclosure practices under accounting, because the Auditor General has said that materiality has nothing to do with whether you correct errors or not. And I just want to make sure I'm quoting the Auditor General correctly when I say that. Materiality has nothing to do with this decision. I believe that's what you said. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. We use materiality, in this case 90 million, roughly, to determine whether or not we qualify the opinion on our reports. that is to say, if there was an error greater than 90 million, we would give a qualified opinion.
Thank you. Ms. Cody, you said you informed the government about the error. The Premier says that he had no idea. How do you just account for that discrepancy, where he said, and I quote, it's simply not true, when he was asked if his government was informed prior to tabling the budget? And again, he answered absolutely not.
Excuse me, I don't think she said she informed. She said the department informed. We haven't even been told whether she was present at those meetings of Treasury Board.
Okay, so same question. The department informed the government. The Premier says he didn't know. He's a member of the government. How do you account for that discrepancy?
The department informed Treasury Board. The Premier is not a member of Treasury Board. It did not present this. The department did not present this, the staff of the department, to Executive Council.
Premier's office staff normally attend Treasury Board meetings, isn't that right?
When they can. Not always, but when they can, for sure.
When the agenda includes approving the revenue estimates or the budget for the year, I think it's hard to imagine that the Premier's office wouldn't have an interest in that meeting. But I know you're not able to confirm whether they were there. We'll pursue that somewhere else. It just seems to me, Mr. Chair, that having a Premier in the dark about a budget with a $27 million hole, either he knew and allowed it to proceed as the head of the government, or he didn't know, which has its own problems because he, through neglect, allowed the people to be misinformed about a significant error in a budget that was presented to them by his finance minister.
Thank you. The questioning from the PC Caucus is finished. We now move to the NDP Caucus for its round of 14 minutes, and we have Mr. Ramey.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming in this morning. And I guess I want to talk about something we haven't talked very much about at all, but it's important to me, and I think to my colleague from Pictou East as well, and that's debt. We know in Canada, at least we've been hearing that individual Canadians are carrying a lot of it, and we know that provinces are carrying a lot of it. And it's my understanding, I may have this wrong, but I think many of the provinces in Canada are carrying significant deficits as well as debt. I think I heard the other day that the province of Alberta, which is always held up as the great shining star, was forecasting a deficit of about $866 million, and they think it might be $1.6 billion, and that's a lot of dough, in my opinion. So I was wondering, because I want to share my time with my colleague from Pictou East, I was wondering if you could just give me a very quick encapsulation, maybe just bullet points on the historical perspective on the province's debt, going back maybe 20 years and coming up to now. I don't know if that's even a fair question for you, but where we were and where we are and that sort of thing.
Sure, I'll do my best. Back in the 80s, let's see, in 1981-82, let's start there. Our net debt level was $1.4 billion. 5 years later, it had grown to $3.2 billion. 5 years after that, it had grown to 4.7. So you can see it ramping up here. 5 years after that, it jumped to 8.7. Okay, so between 1990-91 and 95-96, it went from 4.7 to 8.7. And then it crept up to 98-99, 2000. It was 10.2 billion in 98-99. In 2000, it was 12.1. And then since that time, it has stayed in the 12.2, 12.3 volume. We put a payment down on the debt at a certain point. That took it down again. But it's currently, as of 11/12, it's about $13 billion. This is net debt. So you can see in the 80s and the 90s, it really started to ramp up. But since 2000, it's been 12 billion and slowly creeping. So the growth rate has really modified at that time. In terms of debt to GDP, which is, I think, a really important aspect of debt you have to think about, and that's our ability to sustain our debt. So how big is our economy and how robust is it relative to that? When we look back at the recession time at 2008, between the 08 and 12, we look at Nova Scotia and how it's changed relative to other provinces. The percentage increase in our net debt over that period of time in Nova Scotia was 9.3% between 2008 to 2012. When you compare that to the other jurisdictions, there's been a much more aggressive growth in their debt to GDP. We had, well, in their debt levels, the percentage increase in British Columbia was 58.9. In Alberta, was 39.8. In Ontario, it was 50.4. In Quebec, it was 34%. In New Brunswick, it was 42. PEI 37. In Nova Scotia, it was 9.3. So when you compare how much our debt grew over that five-year period, it did grow, but it was definitely not at a pace that we saw other jurisdictions grow by. When you look at our debt per person, the increase was similarly a lot less on a per person basis. So yes, it did grow during that period because of what was going on in the economy, the need to incur the expenditures to keep the economy moving. That's where we saw a lot of our shovels in the ground activity going on with the federal government. Everybody was doing it, but we were at the same time trying to ensure that it didn't grow more aggressively than it needed to, and to keep our other expenditures in line. So I think we're feeling like, yes, the debt level has grown. It's slowed in the past decade. It's definitely slowed down in its growth. But in the context of our debt to GDP, it's really come down. We were at a time at one point where our debt to GDP history saw us back in 98, 99 at almost 50% of our debt to GDP. We're currently down to about 35%. So we brought that down.
Can I ask you a quick? I got two quick questions, and I promised to hand it off to my colleague. But one was how much was the debt payment? You mentioned we made a payment on the debt. What year and how much?
Do you have that information? We can certainly get that for you. I don't think we might have it at our fingertips right now.
Okay. And the second thing is that I'd just like you to comment very quickly on, if you don't mind, is would you describe the last, well, I don't know, I'll say 4 years as among the worst in terms of the world economy, one of the worst recessions we've had since the Great Depression, or do you think it's just a minor blip?
I don't think it's a minor blip. Whether it's the worst since the Great Depression, I don't think I'm qualified to say that. But it's definitely, it was, well, we all saw it. It was destabilizing back in 2008, and it's been a very slow recovery for everyone. And so it's been very difficult in our forecasting about how robust our economy is going to be when we're still seeing industry struggling to regain the ground that they lost as a result.
So controlling adding to the debt in very difficult economic times is a challenge, but it seems like one that's being met here in the province right now, or reasonably well.
We're working really hard on it, but we recognize that we needed to keep fueling the engine during the recession to keep the economy moving. And
Understood.
To do that, you have to invest those dollars, but to manage it in a way that we're not going to be further debt-laden dramatically as a result of it coming out of that.
Understood and agreed. I'll just pass it off to my colleague, Mr. McKinnon. Thank you.
And Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The member for Lunenburg West has extracted some of the information that I was looking for sure. But one of the things that I want to zero in on is that net debt is usually used as the measure of financial health. Is that correct? And we've already indicated that Nova Scotia has done better than 7 other provinces by a great number of percentage points. In fact, over 40 percentage points higher in at least one jurisdiction and many others close to that. So is the health indicator the net debt usually?
Certainly, the net debt indicator is one that's recommended by PSAP, the Public Sector Accounting Board. In fact, they actually refer to their model of accounting as a net debt model. Is the indicator that they recommend that governments should use for comparison to one another. So it is the one which is not only a indicator, but the leading indicator they recommend for comparison from one to another.
Thank you very much. I want to jump back to the economic assumptions and the reviews that have actually taken place. And I was very impressed with the list that you presented, Deputy, in relationship to the number of parties, the number of banks and economists to a large extent in jurisdictions far beyond Nova Scotia. You indicated that conference call was even used with some of the leading bank people and so on. And with the Conference Board of Canada and APEC and all these economists, have we not heard words like prudent, cautious, and heaven forbid conservative, but fortunately it's a small c. Is that not words that have been used? Can you elaborate on that a bit? Because I think that's fundamentally important when people of leading caliber are using those kinds of words.
Mm-hmm. That's true. They did this year and they did last year as well. After their thorough scrutiny of our economic assumptions, they did use words that would support the level of assumptions that we were building in, that they were very reasonable and prudent.
I think it's fair to say that we always take the AG's recommendations very, very seriously. And I understand that the Department of Finance and the Minister and all parties are prepared to accept and implement most of the AG's recommendations, and many of them have already been addressed, is my understanding. Do you want to perhaps expand on that?
And certainly, if you look at the Auditor General's report of February of this year, of all the recommendations that were in that report, the Department has agreed with those recommendations and has either implemented or has a vote to implement them. Yeah, the one in relations to the timelines, to the revenue estimates, the Deputy's already spoken quite a bit about the recommendations to include the timelines. We have moved on reporting on third-party revenues and the inclusions of those amounts in the revenue estimates, and you'll see that for the first time in the revenue estimates tabled next week. There are another series of recommendations around controls and improvements to internal controls, and we have agreed with those recommendations and are moving forward on them.
Thank you. The chair has already indicated that we can't really talk about the 2013-2014 budget, but I think it is very fair to ask the department if you have confidence in the accuracy of the 2013-2014 budget and the process.
I would say absolutely. Based on the information that we're working with and we're aware of today, I feel very confident that we have reflected it as accurately as we can. I think we're not naive to think that the world won't keep moving and new data will come out and we'll have to reassess it, but we will do that absolutely in our first quarterly update in the fall. But as of the material that we're working with now and the decisions that are made around that, I am very confident that we're on the right track.
In relationship to the AG's recommendations, the government, the current government, has committed to keeping Nova Scotians informed about the progress of its efforts in implementing the AG's past recommendations. And I think we're doing that with more frequency, and in fact laid down a plan in relationship to doing this. And every 6 months, new reports are posted, and they're posted online for all Nova Scotians to see. So certainly the recommendations that have come forward in relationship to finance will be posted, and the large percentage that you have implemented will be known to all Nova Scotians. Is that correct?
Actually, if we get a very brief answer, because I think our time is up here.
Certainly, you'll see that those on the semi-annual reports coming out. We'll see that progress, as you will in the Auditor General's follow-up reports, which is a view of 2 years or older. You should see some improvement on the Department of Finance's follow-up on those as well.
And thank you very much for the leadership that you're showing.
Thank you to our questioners and our witnesses. I'll remind the department witnesses that there was an undertaking to provide the committee with a copy of the letter of advice or direction that was sent to the health authorities with respect to the presentation of their budgets for input, the overall provincial budgets this year. If you could supply that to the committee clerk, that would be very useful. And the second point of information was with respect to the year and amount by which the provincial debt was paid down within the last few years. Again, if both of those items could be supplied as quickly as possible, that would be a big help. Deputy, did you want to have any closing remarks for us?
Thank you. On behalf of Byron and myself, I'd like to thank the Public Accounts Committee for the opportunity to address some of the topics the Auditor General highlighted in his most recent report. In closing, I'd simply like to reiterate that the Department of Finance maintains a very good relationship with the Auditor General's office. We value the work of Mr. Lapointe and his staff, which complements our department's efforts to be continually improving and strengthening our processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Mr. Rafuse. A couple of items by way of committee business. I would just like to note that certain information that was requested from Department of Transportation stemming from the February 27th meeting was received and was distributed to all members of the committee. I just want to make sure that this information, which had to do with local road projects and is called Paving Priority Scoring Sheet, along with a priority list is the item in question. Second, I would note that our next meeting date is set for the 3rd of April. That will have to do with the Department of Education topic of homeschooling. We'll meet at 9 to 11, and this is one of the topics stemming from the Auditor General's report. I should also note that the staff of the committee is trying to organize a subcommittee meeting for April 24th from 11 till 11:30, and we'll be consulting with all caucuses as to their availability of that, but I would ask that the members consider that and, if at all possible, hold that time. That's April 24th, 11 till 11:30 for a subcommittee meeting. Our next item of business today will be a brief in-camera session with the Auditor General, and with that, I thank members and ask for a motion to adjourn. It has been made, and I thank all members for their participation today. Thank you very much.